Hello and welcome to this lab demonstration on managing VMFS data stores. After completing this lab video, you will be able to create and manage VMFS data stores. When your ESXi hosts have access to SCSI-based storage devices, such as Fiber Channel, iSCSI, or local storage devices, you have to create data stores on them so that you can save virtual machine files on the storage. Managing data stores is an essential skill, and this is not limited to creating a data store. Think of a data store where you have lots of thin provisioned disks and where you oversubscribed the capacity of the data store. You have to know how you can add capacity to an existing data store. Presumably, it will be simple to enlarge a data store when you have space left on the storage device on which you created the data store. But what if the storage device of the data store, your LAN, is already fully consumed? Can one data store span across multiple storage devices, across multiple LANs? Or would you have to move to a LAN that has more capacity in such a case? These are the questions that we will answer in this lab exercise. What you should already know is how to navigate the vSphere client user interface, how you can access SCSI-based storage devices, and what LANs are. In this lab exercise, we will first create a VMFS data store on an iSCSI storage device, and we will access its LAN via ESXi host SA-ESXi01. Then we will create another data store, and we will use another ESXi host SA-ESXi02 to access the LAN that we want to use for this second data store. In the next task, we will enlarge one of the two newly created data stores using the available space on its LAN. This process is called expanding a VMFS data store. After that, we will delete one of the two data stores. Then we will add space to the remaining data store that resides on a LAN that is fully consumed by extending the VMFS data store, which means that we are going to use an additional LAN to enlarge the capacity. Finally, we will add another data store on an unconsumed LAN, and in this final task, we will verify that whatever we do on an iSCSI shared LAN via one ESXi host also applies to the other ESXi hosts that have access to the same iSCSI provider, which is the nature of a shared storage. I'm sure I provided you enough good reasons to watch the following video on managing VMFS data stores. Now, let's get started. In the first task of this lab, we will create two data stores on two different iSCSI LANs, and we will access the LANs via different ESXi hosts. We want to perform the configuration on vCenter server SA-VCSA01, so the first step is to connect to this server. Then we log in as administrator at vsphere.local. So in the navigator pane, we go to Storage. We open the data center ICM data center. We right-click our data center, select Storage, and click New Data Store. The type of the data store should be VMFS. So we click Next. Now we enter the name of the data store, VMFS2. We have to select a host that we want to use to view the accessible LANs. So we use ESXi host SA-ESXi01. And now we get the list of iSCSI LANs that this ESXi host has access to. We want to create the data store on ESXi LAN 2, which has a capacity of 11 GB. And we click Next. Now we have to select the VMFS version. We will use VMFS 6, which is the latest version. If you plan to make that data store available to older ESXi hosts that do not yet support version 6, then you would select VMFS version 5. We click Next. On the partition configuration, we have to choose whether we want to use all the available partitions and what the total size of the data store should be. We want to use 8 GB, so not the full 11 GB, and we can use the slider here under Data Store Size to select the data store size that we want. Here we can review the configuration that we did. So basically, we want to create a data store called VMFS2. The type is VMFS and the size should be 8 GB. We see the LAN that we want to use and the version VMFS 6. Now we click Finish. Under Recent Tasks, we can see that the VMFS data store is created. And also in the Navigator pane, the new data store shows up. So when we select the data store here, then on the summary page, we can now see that the data store is of type VMFS 6. We can see the URL of the data store, its location. We see the capacity, so it's close to the 8 GB that we chose. And down here under Details, we can see how many hosts have access to the data store, and we can see the number of virtual machines and virtual machine templates that are stored on the data store. Now let's add one more data store. Again, I'm right-clicking our data center in the Navigator pane. I select Storage and I click New Data Store. Again, the type is VMFS. The name this time is VMFS 3. And this time we want to use the other ESXi host, SA-ESXi02, to access our disks. We want to install the data store on LAN 6, which has a total capacity of 7 GB. Then we click Next. We use version 6 again. This time we want to use all the available space. So we leave all the parameters at their default value to use those 7 GB that we have on this LAN. We click Next. And then we click Finish. The data store has been created. It's listed in our data center. Again, we can have a look at the type, at its location, and at its capacity, which in this case is close to 7 GB. Remember that when we created the first data store, VMFS2, the LAN had a capacity of 11 GB, but we decided to only use 8 of them. In this task now, we want to expand this VMFS data store to use the full capacity of the LAN. So we want to enlarge it by these extra 3 GB. How do we do that? We select the data store in the Navigator pane. We right-click it and select Increase Data Store Capacity. We want to use the available space on LAN 2. That's the LAN that we are using for the existing 8 GB. And you see the LAN itself has 11 GB capacity. So we should find 3 available gigabyte here. And that's what you will see on the next screen. So 3 GB could be added as a maximum. Again, you could use the slider to add less than that. But in our case, we want to use all the 3 GB. So we click Next. Then we click Finish. And we can see that the capacity of the data store changed from something below 8 GB to a little bit below 11 GB. We added 3 GB to this data store. In the next task, we want to have a look at how we can delete a data store. Well, that's very simple. We right-click the data store in the navigator pane, and we want to delete Datastore VMFS 3. And then down here, we have the option Delete Datastore. Just to let you know, you cannot delete a data store that has virtual machines on it. To delete a data store that has virtual machines on it, you would first have to move the virtual machines to a different data store, or if you don't need them anymore, you would have to delete the virtual machines. Only then can you delete the data store. In our case, we have no virtual machines on the data store, so we can simply click Delete Data Store, confirm, and the data store is gone. VMFS 3 is not listed anymore. Now in the next task, we want to extend the capacity of the VMFS 2 data store. Remember, that's the data store where we initially used only 8 GB of the LAN that had a capacity of 11 GB. Then we expanded that data store to use all the space of the LAN, so we ended up at something close to 11 GB. And now we want to extend the capacity, which means we will add another LAN to it. How do we do that? We have to select the data store in the navigator pane. Then we click Configure. Under capacity, we see the current capacity, which as said is a little bit below these 11 GB. And then we click Increase over here. Now we have to select the LAN that we want to use to extend the capacity. And we will use LAN 6. This is the LAN where we initially added our VMFS 3 data store, which we then deleted. So this space is available again, and we want to use this space. So 7 GB should be added. We click Next. We want to use all the space of this LAN. We click Next and Finish. And as you can see, the capacity of our data store is now a little bit below 18 GB. So we added 7 GB to it. Now just to show you, when you click the Hosts tab here, then you can see the ESXi hosts that have access to the data store. And we can see that these are hosts SA-ESXi01 and SA-ESXi02. This is shared iSCSI storage, and both ESXi hosts have access to this iSCSI provider. Now let me show you how you can rename a data store. Let's rename Datastore VMFS2 to Shared VMFS to indicate that multiple ESXi hosts have access to it. We right-click the data store in the navigator pane and select Rename. Then we enter the new name, Shared VMFS, and we click OK. And you see the name is updated immediately. In the next task, we will add another data store. And during the creation of the data store, we will use ESXi host SA-ESXi01 to access the iSCSI storage. And after we created the data store, I will show you another way to check or to verify which ESXi hosts are connected to the data store. So let's go ahead. We select or we right-click our ICM data center. We select Storage and we click New Data Store. It should be a VMFS data store. The name should be iSCSI data store. And as said, we want to use ESXi host SA-ESXi01 to access the storage. We see all the LANs that this ESXi host has access to. We select LAN 5 with a capacity of 130 GB. We click Next. We want to use version 6, so we click Next. We want to use all the available space, so again we click Next and then Finish. So we see the data store being added in the navigator pane, and when I select it, under Hosts, you see the 2 ESXi hosts. That's what we already looked at when we had a look at the shared VMFS data store. But I want to show you another way to list the ESXi hosts that are connected to the data store, and that would be on the Configure tab. When you select Connectivity and Multipathing. And here you see the ESXi hosts that have this data store mounted. So what we see is that since this is shared storage, it doesn't really matter which ESXi host we use when creating the data store to get the list of the available LANs. No matter which one we use, once the data store is created, all ESXi hosts that have access to that same iSCSI provider will see the data store and have access to it, are connected to the data store, and the data store is mounted on them. Congratulations! You have completed the Managing VMFS Data Stores lab demonstration video. In this lab, we first created 2 new data stores. On one of them, we created a data store on a LAN, but we didn't use all the capacity of the LAN. On the second data store, we used the full space of another LAN. And we used different ESXi hosts to access the iSCSI storage. Then we expanded the data store on the LAN that was not fully consumed by adding the available space of that LAN to the data store. In the next task, we removed the data store. Then we enlarged the data store by adding space from another LAN. We extended the data store. Finally, we created another data store and verified that changes on iSCSI shared LANs apply to all ESXi hosts that have access to the iSCSI provider, and how we can easily check which ESXi hosts are attached to a given storage. You now know how to manage VMFS data stores. You understand the difference between expanding and extending a data store, and you know how to check which ESXi hosts are connected to a data store. Thank you for watching this lab demonstration video. I hope the knowledge acquired here will help you with your daily job assignments, and good luck as you continue your journey in VMware world.